everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. Today's video we're going to be doing this flower in water-soluble graphite using the Faber Castel ones. I will try to have everything down in the description below for you. And if you like videos like this, then be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and give a like to the video because it does really help my channel out. But let's just get right into the video. Okay, so for today's tutorial, we're going to be focusing on our values. So we're looking at our lightest lights and our darkest darks for this. Because these are water-soluble graphite pencils, they'll be blending out very smoothly, and it'll be easy to get sort of a gradient, but it'll also be easy to get too much of the dark pigment into the lights. So the very first thing I'm doing here is I'm looking where the lights are and where the darks are, and I'm taking the lightest pencil, which is an HB, and I'm sort of blocking in where the color is going to go, and you'll notice I'm leaving a lot of white spaces, and that's because I don't want to lose too much of the white right away. So I'm blocking in that light, and then I'm going right in with the darkest pencil, which is an 8B, and I'm starting to block in where my darks are going to go. So I have sort of an idea, and then I can start working on my midtones. So this is a great beginner's piece, or it's a great piece for anybody that wants to really focus in if you're finding that your work is not looking as realistic as you want it to look. A lot of the times it's just focusing on your values. So do you have the shadows dark enough? Do you have the lights light enough? Is there enough contrast in there for the object to look 3D or to look realistic? So most of the time, if you take your image that you're working on or your picture and you convert it into black and white, and you take your reference photo and convert that into black and white, you'll get a pretty good idea of where you're at versus where your reference photo's at. So that's one of the tricks that I use a lot when I'm working in different mediums like colored pencil and I want my work to look fairly realistic. These pencils lay down very smoothly on this paper, and they did blend out very smoothly. They layered well over top of each other. I did notice that the 6B, between the 4B, 6B, and 8B, the 6B was kind of, there wasn't a whole lot of difference, so I really focused on the pencils of HB, 2B, 4B, and 8B. I kind of stuck to those ones for this. Also for this piece, because it is a white flower, but right now as you're seeing this, it doesn't look white compared to the background. But that's because even though objects are white, they're not completely white. There's a lot of color in there, there's a lot of shadows, things like that. So once we finish the flower part here, we're going to have to make the background a lot darker to get the flower to stand out. So that's sort of another piece that people have issues with, is not making your background dark enough or not having enough contrast between those two areas. So again, your flower and your background can both look more in the mid-tone range, whereas one has to look lighter and one has to look darker for the object to pop. So focus on that too when you're trying to make realistic pieces. Make sure you have enough contrast between your background, if you're doing a background, and your object. Also, you'll see within this flower here, I'm using the values to create a lot of those curves within the petals. So I'm making sure, towards the bases, where there's more shadow, it's darker, and then as it comes out towards where the light would hit the top of the petals or the sides of the petals, I'm making sure that there's contrast there as well, and that's going to give the petal its shape and form to curve. And here I'm just going in with a second layer once I've blended everything out, and I just used a simple water brush, and I use that for a lot of my tutorials, whether it's watercolor pencils or this one here, graphite pencils, because I find it's very good, it's controllable, and I don't have to keep dipping into a jar, to get water. It's very easy and accessible. So I'm just again going in with the the darkest shadows and the mid-tones, and I'm not really touching the lightest areas anymore because I don't want them to go darker than what they're already at. So I'm basically just hitting the darkest points and a little bit mid-tone areas where I think it needs to darken up just a little bit. Also, another tip is you'll notice most of my pieces and most of the tutorials that I do on here, I always do at least 2 layers. So the first layer I consider just blocking in where our colors are going to go, where our lights and darks are going to go, you know, sort of getting an idea of what I'm laying down. And then the second layer is where we're creating that depth, putting a little more detail into the piece. And I often say, you know, if you want to level up your work, if you want it to look a little more realistic, you know, the more layers you can do, the more detail that you can get in there is the best. So for instance, this piece took me, I think it was close to 3 hours to do. That first layer in itself maybe was 40 minutes worth of work there. So if you would have left it at that point, the piece isn't going to look bad. Your end result's not going to look bad. It might just not look as finished as you would like it to be. And if you're not happy with it, most of the time it's just you need to spend a little bit more time on it, layer a little bit more. You know, and sometimes you have to step back and walk away from your piece, you know, even give it a day or two and then come back and you'll see where you're lacking. You know, so most of the time you'll pick out those spots where, oh yeah, that does need to be a little bit darker, or maybe this little petal is off a little bit, you know, things like that. And it's easy with a flower like this because if you have a petal off, nobody's going to know. Petals go in every which direction. If it's an eye on a portrait that's a little bit off, that's going to be more noticeable. But I find if you just take a couple days, walk away, you'll come back and you'll be able to see where you can improve. And again, these pencils layered very well, especially blending them out the second layer. I noticed the first layer had sort of set into the paper, so it didn't really move as much, but mind you, the water brush that I'm using doesn't transfer a lot of water onto the paper, but I really liked that. Now you'll see me here, I'm going in with the Tombow Mono Eraser, and I'm just hitting the very edges of the petals with this. I'm just sort of trying to get a little bit brighter edge there because some of the light is really hitting on the petals. And I just really wanted to bring that out. And you'll also see me go in with the Faber Castel Perfection Eraser right here. And it has a little bit of a thinner point to it. And I can get those edges just a little bit better. This worked really well with these graphite pencils. Even though they were blended out, I was still able to take just enough to get those really bright highlights off the edge. Now, normally when I'm doing colored pencils or watercolor, I might go in with either the touch-up texture and titanium white with colored pencils or gouache with watercolor. But with graphite, if you go in with another medium, even though it's a water-soluble graphite, if you went to go on top with gouache to get those brightest highlights, it wouldn't look quite right in the piece because it's 2 different mediums. The graphite has a different texture and a different look to it than the gouache will, so it will look quite obvious. So that's why I tried to save as much white areas as I could and then use the erasers to go in. Now this is my first layer on the background. I went ahead and sort of blocked in where I want the lightest lights to go again, and now I'm going with my darkest darks. And I'm sort of following the reference photo, but I mean, if it's not exact, it's a background, it's a blurred out background. I kind of changed a little bit in my second layer to look a little more like the reference photo because I didn't quite like how the bottom right hand corner was turning out. I originally wanted a little bit more brightness there, but then it looked a little off, so I fixed that. Now here is where I would have changed things a little bit. So I'm sort of going in, blending in the lightest areas first, and this is what I always do when I'm blending stuff out. I usually go from light to dark, but because my lightest areas is sort of all over the place in this picture, when I went to go blend the dark here, it sort of created like a line that I couldn't quite blend out as much because the lightest areas had time to dry a little bit. So whereas the petals, they were a little bit smaller, so when I blended one side and blended the other and then came back, you know, it was still wet enough that I could transition it nicely. But the background, you'll notice on the first layer, it's a little more blotchy looking. And I am using a Princeton Neptune watercolor brush here, just because I wanted to see the difference, how they would blend out with that versus the water brush. And honestly, both of them work just as nicely, just as well. So I will go back in with the second layer, and you'll notice, you know, when I start blending the second layer, I'll blend the whole thing around. I won't do, you know, just the light areas and then just the dark areas. And it blends in much better that way. And that sort of leads me to my next tip. Art is a lot of trial and error. So even though you could be perfect with a medium, sometimes you try a new medium and it doesn't come out exactly how you like it, or your first layer is not exactly how you like it. Keep working on it, because you're either going to make it better the more you work on it, or you're going to learn something from it. So I learned that first layer in the background, I didn't like how that blended out. So I'm going to blend it out differently on the second layer. And I like how it turned out that way. So it's all about, you know, trying different things, you know, experimenting, really. Art is a lot of experimenting until you find what you really like. And for art, honestly, I find you're always learning something new, because everything's going to work differently on a different piece of paper or a different medium. And I hope you notice here in the background how just darker that second layer went down and how it blended out a lot darker than that first layer. So these do really darken up nicely as you're laying them over top of each other. That 8B on the first layer wasn't as dark as I want it to be, but the second layer, it just really popped, and you'll see right now just how much that flower stands out. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, I hope you subscribe, give a like to the video, make sure you hit the notification bell so you know when I upload, and go check out the other tutorials that I have on my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video.